Alright everyone, it's time for the Occult, video number 321, Thoughts on Theosophy and some Theosophists. Now of course, in some cases these people weren't always Theosophists. Rudolph Steiner, for instance, I'll talk briefly about him. He decided to leave, he forms Anthroposophy. Actually, the next Occult video I'll focus more on my thoughts about that particular path, but I'll go through a few basic things about him. The first one would be Blavatsky. Blavatsky is sort of the source, the focal point of Theosophy, one of the most major occultists of the century, the 19th century of course, writing her materials. Stanzas of Zion was one of the ones that I edited. Many of her works are on the very long end. She was more of the initial source, and then from there you get multiple branches, I think, essentially, of Theosophy. The unified field itself may be one. It may be, you know, they say there's no higher religion than truth, essentially. And that's basically their motto. Because of that, because of the more eclectic nature of it, what you get over time is multiple other figures. Bessant, you get Steiner, you get Ledbetter, and these people branch out into different areas of material. Now, my thoughts on Theosophy in general at first. I am not a Theosophist, and I definitely don't agree with all of the parts of the theory. Like the Lemurian sort of side of things, while it's very, very interesting, and it does have, I believe, some genuine reality in it. There's some overlap with what has become relatively mainstream archaeology. Look at the island of Santorini, for an example. While that's the case, some of the evolutionism that they delved into, some of the history that Blavatsky claimed to glean from the masters is not real, to be clear. And I've actually had Theosophists run me down for saying this, but you gotta, I mean, if you're going to have a search for truth sort of movement, you have to be willing to let go of things that have clearly been completely discredited based on physical and historical evidence. That being said, there is a great deal of education and knowledge there. And here are my thoughts on some of the actual Theosophists themselves. I'm not a huge fan of Blavatsky for reasons that are arguably contemporary to her own time period, which was she was exposed multiple times, engaged in fraudulent activity, specifically related to trying to materialize letters from spirits and so forth. And of course, if you were to say today, hey, I can talk to spirits and they will materialize a physical piece of paper with literal pen and ink upon it written in human hand, people would understand that it doesn't make sense. Then, as a parlor trick, it involved quite literally, you know, hidden compartments and levers and stuff like that she would operate quite literally during seances. Back then, it tricked people. That being said, she was also a chain smoker and quite irreverent. I find that more endearing than anything else. And her particular hypotheses with regards to human origins, I think, have a massively outsized effect on modern occultism. A huge amount of material, not even mainly theosophical, has been sourced directly from Blavatsky. In that sense, she was one of the most accomplished spiritualists and occultists of modern times, basically since the Renaissance. Then you have, I think, my own favorite, which is Rudolph Steiner. And of course, some Theosophists would look askance to that because, of course, he did lead a schismatic movement away from Theosophy, ended up forming Anthroposophy, which is differentiated in certain social, socio-political, and spiritual senses. I think became arguably Blavatsky's better. The entire Waldorf school system, which is like 1,000 institutions, is rooted in his particular work. His writing was profuse, of course, in German mainly, much of it translated later and often posthumously, some of them not even out of copyright because they didn't get around to translating them till recently. We're talking hundreds of oratorical lectures. His particular initial interest was mainly in the form of soul and human evolution. That was one of his big things. You'd certainly get associated material. His was more on the social, you could say, anthroposophic side. His particular focus, his particular expertise was more in the utilitarian value, the application, I think, of some of the spiritual systems that were being remarked upon. Then you have Bessant, who led the Theosophical Society for decades. Also a prolific writer. Most of the major Theosophists tended to be Bailey and Ledbetter and so forth. Annie Bessant initially was a very political figure. She was even, edited a text, I think a couple of weeks ago, from that perspective. Demonosophy, Theosophy Unmasked, attacks her specifically as a socialist. She left that behind, though. There are elements, I will admit, of socialism within Theosophy, which I find funny in the local datalist debate. And of course, he should be a Theosophist. They agree as you do on some issues. There are trappings of that I deeply despise, actually, because leftism is a poison. And I think it was unfortunate that Bessant specifically was leading the Theosophical Society when there were others that were clearly more capable. That being said, largely she had left that behind before. Her meanderings tend to be more Eastern, Hinduistic especially, into karma, reincarnation, the different planes of the soul beyond life. She adopted a son, actually, declared him to be the next avatar of Krishna, the next incarnation of basically the Savior, who would lead the new age. He didn't have any interest in this and went off onto his own more ascetic spiritual path, and Annie Bessant was sort of left in a lurch. Then you have Ledbetter. Ledbetter is interesting. There were multiple scandals involving him, if I remember correctly. I believe it was Ledbetter with regards to his interactions with young boys. My reading about this, as far as I can tell, is that he was actually engaged in a primitive version of sex education. I do not believe he was a pervert. That was, however, used as an attack against him, both within the Theosophical Society and without. Bessant threw him under the bus, if I remember correctly, initially, and then later on regretted it, having realized, hey, I don't think that anything weird was going on here. This is basically the Victorian moral taboos saying that you shouldn't even be talking about the reproductive system. My understanding is that there was never any case against him because he wasn't buggering young boys. He's not an Epstein or something like that. His focus tended to be on the psychic, the astral realm, and almost quasi-cryptozoology. His focus on elemental spirits and the entities on different planes of existence is profuse. He was more mediumistic. And that's the other thing about Theosophy. There are really, if you look at the literature, you really start to get a sense that there are two major poles, at least of the older literature. I doubt it's like this today. The mediumistic side that was very focused on seances, psychic work, and things of that nature, and this is why I think Steiner really left. The more utilitarian physical side, which was more involved with social progress, evolutionism, history, archaeology, things of that nature. So you have the Steiner side, and then you have like the Ledbetter, Annie Bessant side. And so there's a huge amount of literature about pretty much every sub-subject you can think of. Talking about just Shakespeare and occultism, fairy lore, the history of some ancient tribe, ethnological studies. So Theosophy is a fascinating field. You definitely don't need to be a Theosophist or agree with all or even much of what you read in order to appreciate the core of literature that they did create, some of which is historically valid. It's anthropological, ethnological, primary studies of some of these subjects. Those are definitely something that have been interesting to me. And of course, I've edited dozens of works by Theosophists, partially because there were so many of them writing so many works that it's so easily accessible. It's very, very much there, and it's something that you can work with if you're going to do, what I do, which is occult editing. You can't help but have multiple theosophical works there if you spend any time perusing occult libraries to find material at all. That's about all. Peace out.